So there's something that I tell people all the time when I teach. I say you haven't been kicked until you've been kicked by a Muay Thai fighter, because it's very different from any other type of kick that you've ever had. And you haven't been punched until you've been punched by a boxer, because it's very different from every other style of striking. And that's why I wrote Boxing for Self-Defense, because some of my fondest memories as a child is watching, I think it was the old Friday night boxing matches. You know, it was Tommy Hearn, Sugar Ray Leonard, all the greats from the era. And I would sit up late at night and watch them on TV. Sometimes my dad would watch it with me. We didn't have a great relationship, but that was one of the few times we would watch TV together. And I always found that boxing was, I mean, an excellent system of striking. We have this idea in the West often that, you know, Asian martial arts are so awesome. And that kind of implies that Western martial arts, in particular boxing, isn't the same thing, isn't as good, isn't, you know, very effective. I completely disagree with that, completely. And that's why I wrote Boxing for Self-Defense. And the reason why I haven't written the second and the third part, which I have promised, and a lot of people have asked me about, is because the pandemic happened. I'm self-employed. I was not allowed to work by my government for a very long time, blew through all my savings, and basically had to start a bunch of other online stuff. And as a result, just writing time has been very scarce. And the pandemic is now over, but all the stuff that I started online still happening. So I have to spend a lot of time working on that. And every author is different, but for me, I need to be able to get, you know, like days and weeks on end, be in the same headspace with the same book, and so I can keep on writing. Just jumping in and out, an hour here, 2 hours there, doesn't work for me. So it's been problematic finding that time. So and for the audience, Liam just said that I needed to write more books, and I agree. I need to. I'm working on it. I'm trying. But anyway, welcome Liam to the podcast, Liam Jackson. I typically try to look for a good introduction to the guest, and I couldn't really find one that I liked right away. And then we just chatted a little bit before we started recording, and you sent me your CV. And I said that, you know, it's quite impressive. You said it wasn't meant to be impressive. And I'm like, yeah, but it is quite impressive nevertheless. I'm not going to rattle it all, but just to give the audience a little bit of an overview. So you've been a martial artist for a very long time, judo, goju ryu, and so on. Deputy Sheriff and Training Officer for the Arkansas Department of Corrections, undercover narcotics officer, Chief of Police, Counter-terrorism trainer and subject matter expert for the Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of Justice, and I'm skipping. First of all, my tip of the hat to you, sir, for a full and distinguished career in law enforcement, and you're still here.
Yeah, well, most of me, I'm missing some body parts. I seriously, I've got a lot of screws and plates holding me together. I was very fortunate, very, very fortunate. Yeah, thank you. And it's hard to chronicle, because even having lived through that, it's hard to connect the dots, how one occupation led to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And it's, hell, Em, I was there and I still have trouble wrapping my head around events. But it was a very interesting professional life. Some of it was a lot of fun. Some of it sucked. More of it probably sucked than was fun. But the good times, those opportunities where you had a chance to do something really constructive. I know it's an old cliche, but it made the other crap worthwhile.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and this is something that I often hear from people who had a career in law enforcement. If you manage to do a full career, I mean, there's a bunch of people who only do a few years and then like, I'm out. It's been enough for me. Which, I mean, respect. I mean, anybody who chooses to leave the profession, I can't fault them for anything. I'm sure you know that there's plenty of reasons to stop being a law enforcement officer. But if you go the
There's
distance,
there's a lot. Yeah.
yeah, it's a heavy mantle to pick up, which I always found that the last few years, a lot of people who really have no idea how law enforcement works, what it is that you guys do, are very negative towards law enforcement, and I disagree with them for a variety of reasons. I understand where it comes from, and I am all in favor of accountability and so on. And I'm sure you for you it's the same thing. If you've got a bad cop, I mean, if he's rotten to the core, he needs to be out. He doesn't deserve the badge. But then throw every other officer under the bus at the same time, that just doesn't make sense. And then advocating for abolishing police forces, which we heard starting about 3 years ago. And then all of a sudden, when when crime rates started going up, and then those cries started becoming very silent. And now, and it's so
Yeah.
funny, I see the people who 3 years ago were shouting the loudest, like, we need to defund the police, and are like, no, we never said that. Here is you on the video saying just that. So
Yeah.
what was your experience
It's a
with all
peculiar
that? Go ahead.
it's a peculiar thing when in that people look at police officers and see them as a different species. They're not entirely human, and they're either ego trippers or they're bullies waiting for a place to happen. Police officers come from the same place that produced grocery store clerks and uh, the mechanic at your garage and the people who clean your pool. They come out of the human pool. Things happen. And one of the things that has happened over time is that as violence across the spectrum increased, the police and primarily the politicians of various municipalities were placed under pressure to exert more control. And, one minute you have a socialist type of government administration that says we need to be kinder and gentler and establish all of these social welfare programs, and we need to reach out to the community. And part of that's absolutely true. It will not affect the person who enjoys being a criminal. Uh, so the pressure was applied to various municipal police departments to increase their presence, increase their activity, the level of activity, and much of that happened when gangs really flourished in the 80s and the 1990s. And they still do, but we don't hear about them as much today as we did 20, 25 years ago. But they're still as predominant in a lot of the urban settings, but they've stretched out into the rural settings too. So the police departments almost across the country, with few exceptions, and we're talking about metropolitan, large cities, they did increase their number. They did increase their activity. They did increase, and all of this has a psychological effect on both ends. It affects your communities and it affects the police officers. And very, very soon, you look up and you have developed an us against them mentality. You see a badge, that's them. The badge sees you, that's them, not us, not we. It's us and them. And now, I never once met a cop who went into the business thinking, man, I can't wait to get a badge and a gun so I can just throw my weight around. I never met one who went into the business thinking that. I have known, and I know probably several hundred, if not thousands, of police officers stretched across this country and U.S. territories. Almost, and I'm sure there's a few. I'm sure there's a few just born bullies who wanted that badge. I'm sure somewhere. I never met them. I met the guy who thought he was going to be the hero of the White Knight, serving his community. He would be the one that children looked up to. He wouldn't be the one that moms would say, all right, you better be good or that police officer is going to come get you. Man, that used to kill us when we would hear that. We were conditioning children at a young age to be afraid of the badge. Well, as time progressed and that us against them mentality took root, both sides grew hostile to a degree to each other. I'm not defending a bad cop. I have arrested police officers. They needed arresting. It doesn't make me anything special. It just meant they needed arresting and they were arrested. Uh, but from an ethical standpoint, it's difficult because we know we hold first responder community to a higher standard. We should. We have given a police officer in this country the power of life and death. We gave him a gun and said, you're allowed to use it if this situation exists. Now, to an extent, every citizen has the same power, but not every citizen runs into the same scenarios that your average Metro police officer runs into day in, day out. What a lot of people don't know, Wim, is that in this country, the biggest majority of police officers never pull their gun in their entire career except to go to the range or routine maintenance. We have about 800,000 certified commissioned police officers in this country. If you consider support staff, administrative staff, law enforcement swells to about a 1.2 million. Well, go back and show me how many videos you can find, because everybody's got a camera phone these days. Show me how many cases of police brutality that somebody has taken. Now, obviously, there's been some that were not in a position where somebody could film it. But the point being, of the number of actual officers who engage in that kind of action, I can show you thousands who did not, but we're holding them accountable for the actions of that handful. And it further creates a division between law enforcement and society. And there's one other problem. How many people in the US, and being from Belgium, you know a lot of people here in the States, correct?
Yeah, I do.
How many people that you talk to from the States seem satisfied with US government?
Very, very few of them.
All right. The most significant presence of US government, whether it be city, county, state, or federal, is the police officer. He represents your government. He's the most visible signature of your government that you see on a daily basis. So if you're already unhappy with government, when you see the symbol of that government, it spills over. It can't help it. Then you run into the problem of the mental health of the law enforcement and first responder community. Because I don't care who you are, that kind of environment day in and day out over the course of 2, 3, 5, 6, 10, 20 years carries a toll. And a police officer was not allowed to reach out and seek help when they started going through the emotional issues. They were terminated. I mean, there's only so many desk jobs in any law enforcement community, so I can't just take you off the street and throw you behind a desk. You're a liability because you are now emotionally unstable. You have to go. And a lot of communities, 40, 50, 60,000 population, if you have 3 years on the job, you're considered a senior. Now, how ridiculous is that?
Yeah.
I'll get off my soapbox for a moment now.
I'll get on it instead. So you touched on a bunch of stuff. There's such an amount of misinformation and misinterpretation of information out there for going on for years, and a lot of it has to do with the 24 news cycle, which didn't used to exist. I mean, it's basically the advent of CNN was a big proponent in that, because there didn't used to be 24-hour news. It used to be
Right.
you watch the news, and especially late at night or in the evening, and then it was waiting for the next day. The newspaper would arrive in the morning. CNN basically changed that whole process, and they went, I mean, basically 24/7 all over the world, just news, 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 just repeating it. Then the internet came along that amplified that as well, and then you would just be bombarded. You've got a generation now who's grown up with, anytime they watch the news, anytime they go on social media, I mean, the slightest thing happens and they're like, oh my God, this police brutality is happening every day, all the day, about 10,000 times or more. And then I'm like, hold on, there are statistics of this that you can look up, and we can talk about validity of statistics. That's a whole different discussions, but there are some numbers out there. I forget how much it was, but it's like every year there are millions upon millions of interactions between police officers and citizens. Millions. And literally only a handful of them end up with somebody, with a police officer shooting the person he's interacting with, and that person dies. And just recently I read that, and I forget where it was, but that bunch of people were asked, like, okay, how many unarmed Black people are shot each year by the police? You get people who said tens of thousands, others said thousands, others say hundreds, and it was like last year, like 24. Now I will be precise: unarmed Black people, Black citizens, not armed. That is a totally different category. But that is the mindset of today. That's kind of what lives with a lot of people. It's like, well, the police is just going out and shooting random Black people who are unarmed. No, it's not happening. That's not happening. But it goes completely counter to the narrative of today. And I'm like, it has. I don't care if you're black, green, white, yellow. I mean, I don't care what your skin color is. It's about just having an agreement on a consensus on what reality is like. And then we can go into interpretations, politics, ideologies, and so on. But we have to be able to agree on a basic standard for reality. And what I find is that, especially with young people, and with that I mean people in their 20s and 30s, that is just not for all of them, but for a lot of them, it's completely out of whack with reality. Okay, I'm stepping off the soapbox now.
Well, there are occasions when the soapbox needs to be dragged from the corner and somebody to stand on it. But we live in an era where it's always doubtful if anyone is really listening. Uh, most people that engage in this debate, representing both sides of that argument, they're not listening or waiting for their turn to call you an idiot. We don't communicate very well as a species. Now, I live in the South. I have worked all over. I don't know how many states I have been in the course of my federal time. Um, but for anybody to say that racism is, dying or fading away or going away, yeah, there's obviously some evidence of that. 20 years ago, you would not see a television advertisement in the United States of a biracial couple.
Yeah.
You wouldn't. Today, you see it every day. And Caucasian male with an African descent female, Asians with Caucasians, Asians with members of the Black community, Hispanics with whomever. The narrative is changing, but in doing so, it's amplified the voice of those who still feel disenfranchised. And there is a significant number of those. Racism is alive and well in the United States. I will tell you this, there's probably less of it in the South that there is in portions of the northern states. I've seen it firsthand, and I understand why. It's a socioeconomic issue. Uh, but you go into the western states, you still see some hard, lingering bad attitudes between mainstream society and Native Americans in some pockets out there. It's hard to wrap my head around that.
Yeah.
But this discussion is a good thing as long as people are willing to discuss and not cuss. Uh, Too many people are just waiting for a chance to call you a fool, and they're not participating in the actual narrative of the subject. I don't know what the answer to racial discord is. I do know this. In this particular country, it's more of a case of the haves versus the have-nots, more so than it is a racial problem. There's such a distinct line that goes between the upper middle class and upper class, and even the lower middle class and the lower class. Economically speaking, the division is ridiculous. And part of that is due to large corporations outsourcing so many jobs. But it goes beyond that. And I wish I really was better as an economist so I could solve the problem. But we have such a significant portion of the population living right at the poverty level in this country. Now, granted, our poverty level is way above that of many other countries.
Yeah.
You take a tour through Central America or any third world country, and our poverty level would be at their upper end of the economic spectrum. We're a little spoiled over here.
Yeah,
really
and that's true. And I was fortunate to in my life to been able to travel a lot to many different continents, including third world countries and so on. And that's what I try to teach my children. And when I talk to people who live in modern Western societies and they're complaining, and I'm like, look, I get it. I don't disagree per se. But when people start going into hyperbole, like this is the worst ever, and this is a genocide, this is an epidemic, this is the worst thing ever, and so on. I'm like, actually, it can be a whole lot worse, and I can tell you where you can go right now, where things are exponentially worse on whatever front, whether it's economical, whether it is social, whether it is the justice system, whether it is law enforcement. You want to see crooked cops? I'll show you crooked cops. And you want to have this
border.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that this is something I've been saying for a long time, is that you bring your attitude that you have in your Western country where you think you can lip off to a police officer. You bring that to some of the countries that I can put you in right now, today. See what happens. You not only will you regret it for the rest of your life, but you won't have the rest of your life. It's going to be very short and painful.
The culture shock would probably stop your heart if you really saw what occurs in many of the so-called third world countries. But even countries that are on the other end of the spectrum economically, and we'll just China, for instance. I don't know of any single, and I know many people of Asian heritage and descent who are anxious to go back to mainland China for any reason. You don't see many dissidents from other countries applying for citizenship in China. I could stop right there. Yeah. One of the things that I have been blessed with in a martial arts program, and I've been running our program here, even before I retired, I was sent back to the same military base that I was born on, the Pine Bluff Chemical Weapons Arsenal in central Arkansas or south central Arkansas. And Department of Justice and Department of Defense had a joint operation, and they had to have a headquarters. Well, different military bases applied. Uh, there's something called Center for Excellence Award that's given to a certain number of military installations every year. Well, Pine Bluff Chemical Arsenal was designated as one of those centers, and it was awarded the contract for Department of Justice and Department of Defense to establish an operation there. And I wound up there. And just so happened, my wife was one of the administrative assistants for the training center for Clara Bark, the Red Cross, which also got sent to the same Pine Bluff Arsenal. During that period, well, I'll tell you, let me shut up on that for a minute. And I think you had a question you were going to ask a minute ago about, maybe I'm wrong, but about the number of, or is a statement you made about the number of violent encounters between law enforcement and society.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that there's this very much a disconnect between reality and what people think it is when it comes to, for instance, use of lethal force by police and police brutality.
How do you fix that, Wim?
Sorry?
How do you address that? How do you address that disconnect? From your perspective, how do you?
That's I'll give you my answer, but that's what I wanted to ask you. Is that I find it extremely difficult because again, that's what I mentioned before with 24/7 news cycles, internet, and so on. By the time something has gone viral, everybody knows it. The narrative is firmly in place, and I've seen that, for instance, with the Rittenhouse trial, with a bunch of other high-profile trials that I followed every single minute of the court proceedings as they were, they were live streamed on YouTube. I watched every single thing of it, and a lot of information only came out then that the media didn't report. There were also a lot of information that was available, like the first or the second day after an incident, that a lot of people have forgotten by the time it gets to court. So there's this whole disconnect of information, disinformation, and at the same time, as the court proceedings are happening, which is a shit show in and of itself all too often, people are finding out new information. They get it from the news, which has its own slant and ideology all too often, which is by far not neutral. And if you don't watch every single hour of the court proceedings, you just don't know. I wrote some stuff back in the day when the Rittenhouse trial was going on and when the verdict was reached, and I was like, I'm not surprised. And then a lot of people were very angry with me, and I was like, look, this and this and this, what you just said is wrong. It is factually wrong. You can just watch the court deciding on this. Watch the elements being introduced during the trial. And watch the video evidence, watch this, watch that. It's all there. Watch the testimony of people who were there. Whether it's eyewitnesses, whether it's one of the attackers of Rittenhouse and so on. A lot of that stuff, it's just they flat out said it. Now, you don't have to like the outcome. You don't have to agree with what Kyle Rittenhouse did. That is besides the point. The point is you had a certain opinion based on a narrative, based on ideology and maybe politics. And it turned out that the conclusion that you attached to that whole thing was wrong. Now, that is difficult to accept in a polarized society. Because it touches you to the core. So you have to force yourself to be open to the possibility that maybe you're wrong. And me, you, everybody else. And this is extremely difficult because we're so polarized right now. And everything is political. So what I try to do is I try to always look at the evidence that is presented and then don't comment all that much in the beginning. there's bound to always be incomplete evidence, especially when it's videos. They're all too often edited or stuff is left out. And then only by the time you get to court, that's when all the evidence comes into light. I started doing that years ago when I made some, personal comments or conclusions that I came to certain cases, and it turned out that once the trial happened, that I was totally wrong. I'm like, okay, this is not a way to proceed. If you just go by outrage, something you find it outrageous, this has happened, and you're angry, well, you're by default no longer being neutral or being just an observer who tries to get to the truth. You want to get to a specific outcome. Whereas supposedly, and that should be the goal, the justice system is trying to get to an outcome that is legally justified. And that outrage has nothing to do with it. So I find it very difficult to talk to people with this about this, because all too often they are stuck in the outrage phase. And I'm like, we can do outrage. There's a bunch of stuff that I found outrageous, and that makes me very, very angry. So, and then an offer like, okay, we're going to do yours first, and then we're going to do one of mine. And then typically they're like, I don't know anything about that. And then I respond to them, how would you feel if I right now start chastising you for not caring about this, for not knowing about this, for not being outraged and angry over something horrible that is happening to certain people, but you never heard of them? You would be like, hold on, Wim, just calm down. Whoa, what's going on? Well, this is how you act towards everybody else when it's this particular case of police brutality, use of force, and so on. I'm like, so unless you're willing to accept that everybody has the right to basically chastise you and get in your face because you don't care or you know about something or you disagree with somebody about something, unless you're okay with everybody doing on any topic this to you, just shut the fuck up. All right, that's me.
You just touched on the biggest one. You're being held accountable and deemed guilty for something that you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
It's not simply a matter of I don't know about this problem. You had no idea that that particular scenario it was even in existence. So I'm being judged and found guilty over what I don't know that I didn't know. I sound like a redundant statement, but it's so true in life, in every aspect of life. But you know
Yeah.
what I was getting to is how do we fix this? Um, Arkansas, like many of the southern states, has had its issues with racial and class, economic class division. Uh, but I can't think of too many states in the United States that haven't gone through some kind of that. Uh, we had this state had some notoriety back in the '60s when federal law dictated a desegregation of a certain large Caucasian high school, and federal troops actually showed. 101st Airborne showed up.
That was with the little
escort
black
them.
girl, I think, right?
Well, there were 9 of them, 9
Okay.
black students.
Yeah.
In fact, they're called today the Central 9 or the Little Rock 9 for Central High School. Uh, Pine Bluff, the town that I'm closest to and that I work in, uh, is an odd town. We're talking about a community of about 41,000 that averages over 30 murders a year. Do the math per capita and find me another city in the United States of 40,000 people that's going to average between 28 and 34 murders every year. You can't find one. We tried. When I was working for DOJ, we tried. It's not out there. Uh, but, the community has always been violent. I mean, my own family, I came from a very violent family. I have a brother doing time for murder right now. I was lucky. You know, he went one way, and I wasn't smarter. I was just more fortunate that I fell on the other side. But when we talk about addressing and fixing these issues, and it's such a complicated issue. But in my martial arts program, and I mentioned that, you know, we're located right close to the Pine Bluff Chemical Arsenal. It was a chemical manufacturing and storage facility, but they also did biological. My dad worked in the Defense Biological Operations at that same base back in the 50s and 60s. And that part of the community it's so odd. It's almost like you could draw a line on the ground that you had entirely Caucasian living in this little small group. And you step across the sidewalk, and as late as the 1970s, it was about a 60-40 ratio. You have about 60% Caucasian, 40% African American. Well, today, it's that little small community has quadrupled in size, and it's still primarily white. On the other side of the sidewalk, it's about 70% African American. But in my program, I have got Israeli, I've got Hebrew kids, Palestinians, Iraqi, Hispanic, Belarus, India. I know I'm missing one or two nationalities, but that's the group that I have, in addition to homegrown white and black kids. They're all in the same room. They all train together. They all sweat together. They all get bloody noses together, and they all hug each other around the neck when they get through beating the crap out of each other. If there's not a lesson there, I don't know where else to find one. I mean, try putting an Israeli and Palestinian adult in the same room and let the discussion of politics come up. Devout Muslims, I think I have 5 or 6 families of devout Muslims. 2 of my black belt instructors that work for me are Christian ministers, but yet the Muslim parents allow these Christian ministers, to train their children and interact with them and form relationships with them. Now, I've been out of the travel sector now for a decade. I don't travel like I did. I don't see as many communities and different societies as I did for a very long time when I worked in that venue. But I don't know that the world as a whole has changed that much. So I don't know. And if somebody asked me to come to their town and establish those types of relationships that we enjoy and establish that there, I don't know that I could do that. I don't know how. I don't know why it happened. But I do know that given a common denominator, all of a sudden, all of the deep philosophical divisions between those groups seemed to take a back seat.
Yeah.
They were more and are more interested in achieving a common objective now than they were any past grievances between ethnicities or races. I don't know that that's an answer, but it's an indicator. It's an indicator that communication and relationships can overcome damn near any past grievance, provided you're willing to work toward common objective.
Yeah.
I don't know how to force that on society, but I wish the hell I knew, because I would start doing it today.
I talked about this on my Facebook page, I think a while ago, and it's basically I use the analogy of reaching out your hand across a broken bridge. And this came after I was listening to an interview with a scientist, and he mentioned something basically in passing that we don't have non-political or non-contentious aspects of society anymore, as everything is polarized and politicized. And he says you used to be able just to go watch a football game and like just cheer for your side, and the other people cheer for their side. And at the end of the match, like, okay, you won, you guys suck, we're awesome, and so on. But then that was it. You could just go through the same door, and you're good. Now even football is politicized. Everything's politicized, so the common ground is lost. And that scientist made this point, like, we should be able to talk to somebody and say, look, I disagree with you on every single thing except this. Here we have common ground. Let's build on that. And that takes a lot of work. It takes an openness of basically the way you view the world, and understanding that that is the way out of the mess we're in right now. Because the alternative, not doing that, means more conflict. It can only lead to more conflict. So I call it like, okay, imagine that society is a bridge and it's collapsed, and there's people on either side. You want to basically repair that bridge. How do you do that? You start by reaching out. Now, you reach out your hand to the guy standing on the other side, not naively, because if he's an asshole, he's going to pull you into the void and you're dead and your side loses you.
True.
No, what you want to do is be careful, be cautious, but you start by reaching out. If he proves that he is indeed an asshole, he doesn't deserve your trust, you pull back your hand and you're done. That's it, we're done. If he's open to that, we can start there and hopefully get further. And what you said, okay, you bring people together in your martial arts program, and it doesn't matter what background they are, what the religion is, and so on. You run a tight ship. You're a good teacher. You make sure that everybody does what needs to be done, and we leave politics and religion at the door, and we're here to train. I've had people in my class, in my MMA class, who were far right activists and a far left activist, but they didn't know it of each other. I knew. They didn't tell me, but I knew, and it was fine. And they had all the opportunity in the world to be basically an asshole to each other and hit the other guy in the face when I wasn't watching. Never happened because they didn't know. So they had this common ground of MMA that they both liked and enjoyed, and worked together to train and help each other get better. Now, it wasn't my place to comment like, hey, that guy that you just enjoyed talking to, you guys were laughing. Okay, he's actually on the opposite side of you ideologically. Everything you hate about ideology, that's him. And same thing for you. It wasn't my place, so I never did that. But my point is that it's possible. And it's by focusing on that as opposed to all the things that divide us. Now, mind you, the division is important. There are good reasons why people have different opinions. And if you can start by accepting that it's not about converting people to your cause, because you might be wrong. Unless you think you're God, then you're infallible. If you have that kind of ego, then there's really no point talking to anybody, because you know everything and you're perfect. But being human might be interesting, to be a little bit more humble and accept that, okay, I might be wrong. It could be worth listening to the other person, if only to look at my arguments in favor of my position again, maybe strengthen them, learn something from the other side, and so on. And then everybody wins, nobody loses. But if everything is zero sum, which it isn't, by the way, but if everything is zero sum, there's only conflict. So what I propose is that doing that, you reach out across the broken bridge very carefully and start to build from there. And at the same time, accept that fundamentally, more than one thing can be right at the same time. It's not either or. We can both be right from our points of view, from our position, for different reasons. And that is something which I think has been lost. And the only way to reestablish that is by talking to people. Be a good faith conversationalist. Meaning that you start with good faith. Everybody gets good faith from me at first. If I notice bad faith from the other side, I will call them out on it. if they are sincere and like, oh, I didn't mean to do that, because a lot of people, they act in bad faith, they don't even know it, they were just indoctrinated by, asking certain questions a certain way and discussing in a certain way, which is basically, cheating. It's a bunch of rhetorical tricks and so on. And sometimes when you call them out on it, they get it, and they're like, "Oh, I didn't mean to be like that." But if they insist, then I'm like, "We're done. This leads nowhere. This is a waste of my and your time. You are not here to honestly discuss things with me. You don't look for consensus. You are here to win, and you only want to
You
win."
just described you just described American politics from the federal all the way down to the local level. And it goes back to what you said earlier about court. Nobody cares about the damn truth. They care about winning.
Yeah.
Whichever side you are assigned to, it's all about winning. If I can produce enough evidence, whether it be circumstantial or hard, and it supports my position and I win, I don't give a shit if you were innocent or if you were guilty. I won. The same side operates the same way. And frankly, the federal government in this country is one of the worst offenders. We have about 2.5 million employees employed by the federal government in this country. Um, that doesn't even include all of the subcontractors who work for the government. If we added all of those into the equation, we're probably looking at 3.5 million people. We have so many departments. Even the Department of Justice has got probably 10 different offices that operate underneath their umbrella. And they're all supposed to be on the same page, working on projects that support a common objective. And at first glance, it is. But each one of those entities is a mini kingdom. They're autonomous in a lot of respects. And every year, they are fighting for a segment of that budgetary pie. If I have to do that, if I have to increase my position by making you look bad, that's an old tactic in the government. The FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, from DARPA to ATIP to you name it, they're all fighting for the same pie. And even though they have some common objectives, that's not what defines their mission. And if I have to make your mission look like shit in order for me to get a bigger piece of the pie, that's what I'm going to do. That's the federal mindset. Um, Before they placed everything under FEMA, you had ICE over here, you had the Office of Justice Programs over here, and you had the CIA over there, and the FBI over there, and all of these agencies, like FBI and CIA, operated under a different flag. But the Office of Justice Programs had dual. They operated under DOD and Office of Justice or Department of Justice. And sometimes they couldn't decide who they needed to represent in order to get the bigger money. So one minute they're hugging the necks of the DOD people. The next minute, fuck the DOD, we're going to hug the necks of the Department of Justice people. Whatever it takes to get the most money. Department of Transportation, which is huge in this country, and which controls air marshals, Monty's bunch, controls trucking, all commercial industry that moves by freight. DOT is in charge of all of this shit. They fought tooth and toenail to avoid being placed under FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management. It's such a dogfight, and it starts at that level. So honestly, the average American citizen who looks at government as a single entity, a single evil, shadowy entity, has no fucking clue the amount of infighting between the various agencies within the government. Now, you want to talk about a real dogfight? of ideology, that's where it's at. And it has nothing to do with which party is uh, controlling Congress or the Senate. It has everything to do with there's only so many dollars that's going to be allocated for your annual budget. How are you going to fight for it? So that battle starts there. And it has probably done more to hold us back than it ever did to move us forward. And I don't know that there is a fix for that one. It would be easier to address the issues within society in general than it will ever be to fix the fucking government. I don't know that it can be fixed, but it's so massive. It is so massive. There's not even a place to start fixing it. Electing a president every 4 years doesn't do it because those agencies look at him as a temporary employee of the country. At most, he's going to be there 8 years. Some of these department heads have been on the job 40 years. So I don't care who gets elected, he's looked at as, or she is looked at as a temporary employee. They don't need to know everything. They're not going to be here long enough to make a real difference. That's the attitude of the larger departments within the federal government.
It's very similar over here. Yeah.
Is it?
It's very similar over here in I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I live in a country, it's about 11 million people. There's two big ethnic groups speaking a totally different language, have a different culture. There's one smaller ethnic group, German, because after the Second World War, we got the part of Germany as a compensation. But they typically don't ruffle a lot of feathers. Brussels is a state basically of itself, has its own government. Anyway, it's a big mess. There are multiple governments and so on. Just to give you an idea, when the pandemic broke out, we discovered that we had 8 ministers of health for 11 million people.
8?
So you could 8, yeah. So
8.
It took months to figure out who was responsible for what. Yeah, I should mention for the audience that you're struggling a little bit with allergies. So just so everybody knows, so it's totally messed up situation. Now, one of the things that happens over here, and just also today, we are still world record holder, #1. Eat your heart out, America. We are #1 in the world of taxes on the wages that the money that you earn through working. I don't know what, there's a technical term, I don't know what is in English. So not your investments, not your savings account that has that you or investments or stock that you sell, but just when you work a 9-to-5 job, your wages, yes, the earnings from wages. We have the highest taxes in the world. It's 50 whatever percent. I forget how much it is. It's huge. Now we have huge government, as I just explained, 8 ministers of health, which is insanity for 11 million people. Now, you would think that governments here would understand that we kind of have to basically cut our budget a little bit, cut our own flesh, as opposed to always increase taxes, because you can't keep on increasing them forever. So what typically happens over here is that one of the governments will say, like, look, okay, everybody, you need to save more money and you have to lower your budget. And then a bunch of people who mean well will say, okay, this is what we'll do. We'll save 5% here, 10% there. And at the end of the whole calculus, they end up with, let's say, 20% savings, less budget for them. All the assholes who are in those administrations say that there's no fucking way I'm doing that. I'm just going to say, like, no, I can't save anything. I mean, it's like we are stretched so thin. This is skeleton crew only. I mean, there's no way we can save more than we already have. And we have been saving for years on end. We're underfunded as it is. We actually need more where they don't, where they could do the exact same exercise, save 15-20% on their budget, but they don't. So what ends up happening is that the assholes get the budgets, the people who mean well don't get the budgets, and they're like, crap, there's no way I can make this work because I don't have any means to do so. So they eventually quit, and then another asshole takes his place, and you've got this perpetual cycle of arrogant clowns and idiots who run everything, and they can't make anything work. I'm going to give you a very quick example. Brussels is the center of my country. NATO is here. The European Union headquarters is here. There's a bunch of stuff here. It's quite important. There's a highway around Brussels called the Ring Around Brussels. There's a big bridge that is one of the most traffic intense spots in Belgium. That bridge was built in the 60s, and it took about 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. Now it's old, it needs to be replaced. They're going to start in August to do that. It's going to take 7 years to do that. And I'm not counting delays. So in the 60s, they could build it in 3 years. Today, 2023, it takes 7 years. What went wrong? Something went wrong here. It's not material science. It's not construction techniques that haven't evolved. No. It's on the government level. It's on administration level. It's on all the requirements, all the different procedures that have to be followed, all the committees that have to get together to decide something, and so on. And it takes 7 freaking years. It's going to be, pandemonium. Traffic's going to be. We already have very, very high traffic, and people have no idea how bad it's going to get. Okay, I'm going to step back off my soapbox now, and we're going to change the subject a little bit. Could you talk a little bit about your undercover work that you did? What was that like?
Well, it's UC work is comes in different flavors. It's by degrees. You can work a very short term, in which you take an officer, you let him grow a 3 or 4 day shadow, you put him in some clothes, you send him into a bar, and let him fish for information. If somebody is selling an 8-ball of Coke behind the counter, a bar barista, you may pop him and you may not. You may want to watch and see where it leads to. So you have a short term. Then you have the long term. Long term can last anyway from 30 days to 6 months, in which case you go into a jurisdiction where you don't have any known ties or relationships. You have an apartment, have all of the typical fake credentials, driver's license, et cetera, et cetera. You look for a job. There's always one. And then you start hanging out in places of interest, and you see where it leads. Sometimes you have the lead going into that situation. You know who your target is. You just have to find a way to reach the target. Other times, you're going in cold, and you have to really understand where you're at. If you go into an area and you're carrying a 1911 model 45 caliber para-ordnance LDA, that's not characteristic of the folks who live there and run around there, and you are marked from get-go. So you may be in a jurisdiction where your only firearm, if you even have one, is an RG-22 caliber that's held together by rubber bands and super glue. It might be good for 1 or 2 shots if you need it. More often than not, you don't carry it. You don't carry any identifiers. Normally, you have a control officer or safety officer who knows where you are about. You have scheduled check-in times, rendezvous, where you have to make contact, usually by phone, sometimes by Dropbox. Every operation had similarities, but they all had their differences too. Everyone had a challenge. I normally carried a screwdriver or a K5 type blade knife, and that's more often than not. I didn't even have a firearm when I was going into the bars or the strip joints, or in some cases commercial business. One of the biggest cases I ever worked involved a wrecking or a tow truck company. It led to about a $1.2 million arrest. Um, every case was a little different, and one similarity is they all made you a nervous wreck because there was nobody to reach out to. You were it. By the time the cavalry got there, the smoke was cleared. You know, and if you had a problem, well, I realized that MOs and you know, methods of operations have changed over the years. I can't imagine that they have changed that much since when I was involved with it. Uh, Occasionally, you work with a partner, and you got help. You can keep an eye on each other. Most of the time, you are on your own. Excuse me.
Go
Now time for more Benadryl.
ahead. So let me ask you a question.
I don't know. Sure.
This is something I like to ask people because it's always good to contrast that, and we've got all these cop TV shows, movies, and so on, where it's about an officer who's undercover, this and that, and there's a lot of tropes that come back, like he falls in love with one of the bad guys, whatever, sister, wife, and so on. Everybody is crooked. I mean, from all the brass is completely crooked, and it's a setup to get him killed, or something along the lines of that. He just goes off the reservation and does his own thing. What are some of the things that you would say Hollywood routinely gets wrong about undercover work?
Damn near all of it. I do know of cases where officers were assigned to work uh, inside of gangs, such as biker gangs. And because of the nature of the atmosphere that they worked in, they wound up doing drugs. And in a couple of cases, they wound up hooked. Um, you don't get much more deep under than that if you're trying to work uh, inside a major biker gang on the West Coast or the upper Midwest in this country. Um, in fact, it doesn't happen that much anymore. There's different, I'm sorry,
That's okay.
different ways to pull surveillance, there's different ways to keep tabs, different ways and more technologically efficient ways to conduct investigations than trying to slip somebody on the inside. You know, you're sitting in a room, a smoke-filled room, and you got 5 or 6 of the suspected bad guys, and one of them pulls out a little metal box with a syringe in it and says, "Your turn. What are you going to do?"
Yeah.
Most of us had stories that worked pretty well. Okay, I worked down at Lowe's Construction, and you know, I'm a convicted felon, so I'm piss tested randomly by my parole officer, and I also get piss tested by the company. And you know, man, if I get busted, I'm screwed. I got no place to go, nobody to depend on. So you know, my favorite line was when something was presented to me to use, I would tell them just straight out, that shit is for selling, not for using. I'm trying to make contact here to become a dealer for you. That was my angle most of the time in a long-term UC operation.
Yeah.
So I would tell them, I don't use the shit, I just sell it. You know, I got to stay straight so I can make money for this. It always worked. I never had anybody pull a gun and say, no, you're going to do it or else. I have heard of cases where that did happen, but that was that line of work put me into contact with a domestic supremacy group, and I got really bad crossways with them. Uh, and they have bad attitudes when they don't like you. They do all sorts of nasty shit. In fact, my wife's over here behind me. I had known her for about a month, and this was 38 years ago, and we decided to move in together. I mean, it was just quick. We lived in Little Rock, the capital city of Arkansas, and I was down south at Pine Bluff, 40 miles south, and I had not been in the field for a couple of years, not in the UC capacity, but she knew my history, you know, and didn't hold it against me. So I'm on my way home, and an Arkansas state policeman pulls me over and asks me, you know, for ID. I tell him. Well, the second state trooper pulls up and gets in front of me. I'm parked on the shoulder of the highway. And the first trooper says, okay, I need you to follow us to your home in Little Rock, 40 miles away. That doesn't happen. Well, I panicked. I thought something had happened to my girlfriend at the time. And they assured me that everything was fine, but I needed to follow them. So I had an escort, one in front, one in back, and they took me all the way 42 miles to my apartment in West Little Rock. When I got there, there were 6 uniformed police officer cruisers in the parking lot in front of my apartment. There were 4 uniformed police officers standing in my living room, one of them being the shift commander, or a shift commander or a precinct in a town of 250,000 people. My wife, who at the time was my girlfriend, is sitting on the couch on the sofa. And here's the weird part, man. There was a 12 gauge semi-automatic Remington shotgun, ours, sitting on the sofa right beside her. Now, again, we're talking about the United States. A police officer goes into a house and sees a gun. That thing gets secured really, really quickly. In this case, they left it laying there beside her. There had been a confidential informant, a trusted CI, who had called the Arkansas State Police and told them that I was to be shot on the drive home to my apartment that night. As the story unfolded, it was myself, a federal judge named G. Thomas Isley, and a Western District U.S. federal prosecutor that were all supposed to be killed. Fast forward 10 years later, I'm working narcotics again. And frankly, I didn't give a flying shit about weed. My heartburn revolved around smack and crank, heroin and methamphetamine. And I had something of a reputation for going after meth really hard. And it was about 1 a.m. and my dog started barking. We lived rural, and they started shooting my house. But my wife, we were married by now, and we had a daughter who was 6. They're laying in a cast iron bathtub. Our house was rock, stone house. They're in the bathroom, down in the bathtub. I'm in the kitchen, and all I could see is muzzle flash. They'd already shot the night watcher light out. shot my dog, shot the car, shot the house. We picked up, I think, 117 shell casings out of the drive and along the tree line the next morning. The local county sheriff's department responded very quickly. State trooper came out, obviously, but it all happened in a very short amount of time. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 minutes. I went through 40 rounds and never cut a hair. So, but again, pitch black. They were in the tree line, and it was all related to that work. So when people ask me about doing that kind of work, that's the best fucking example I can give you of doing that kind of work. Now, of all the years that I did that, I only had those two incidences that were, of that nature. But hell, that's enough. I mean, that's plenty for my lifetime.
Yeah, that's all the excitement you need.
So,
So
it's more than I fucking wanted. But here's something also to remember. Within a 10-year span, my current wife went through those two incidences and somehow stayed married to me for 37 years, for which I am very, very grateful. Because had it been almost anyone else, they would have hauled ass after the first one.
Yeah.
You live with a guy for 1 week, and the next thing you know, you got the whole goddamn police department in your living room. That's enough to scare a lot of people off. So my wife got more balls than I got. I mean, bless her heart. That's a tough woman.
So I wanted to ask Liam. I mean, because it's a very specific situation that you just described. If you go through something as extreme as that, I mean, you've got people just lighting your house up, and you've got your wife and kid in the next room. It's one thing going through a firefight like that, where it's your own life on the line. But at the same time, knowing that your loved ones are just right there, and there's nothing you can do right at the moment to help them. It's like you just have to write it out. What was going through your mind at that point? Like, if you can remember, or if that's even something you can put into words.
Wim, I've tried to sort through, even after all this time. It's not something I especially like thinking about. There are some members of the animal list who know that story, which is the only reason I'm going through it now on your podcast. Hell, it's not like it was a big secret. I assume you've also heard the story about the time I arrested myself.
You mentioned it briefly, but
that yet?
I know a little bit about
John
it.
Kerr was the one that.
Go ahead.
The same the same persons that shot my house up. About a week later, allegedly were drunk, and they went into a convenience store, and they were talking about the incident. They were talking about being the shooters. The convenience store clerk called me and actually called my wife, and then the word got back to me. But she wouldn't give a statement. She wouldn't sign anything. She was scared to death of them. And it's another long story, but the mayor of that town was already under federal indictment for drug trafficking. He was waiting to be sentenced to go to prison. The mayor of that community. And it was one of his henchmen that had been involved, by his own words, in the shooting. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't. There was no, other than his comments to a third party who refused to give a written statement. She considered herself, that clerk considered herself tipping us off so we could be aware. But she would not go a step further than that. Well, I thought about that for 2 days, round the clock. I couldn't get it out of my head. On a Sunday, I'm coming into town, and lo and behold, on Main Street, America, there is this guy. I pulled the car over. I took my badge off. I took the gun. I put it in the trunk, and I walked across the street to where he was walking. And I cut him off, and I told him I knew. And it probably would have ended right there, except he started laughing. The next time I saw him, he was in a ProMed ambulance going to a particular hospital. Unfortunately, this all happened at about 12:20 p.m. on a Sunday, a block away from the largest church in that town. They all saw what happened. They
Yeah.
didn't know the context. They didn't know the backstory. They knew I'd had some trouble, but nobody knew the backstory in regard to this particular person. So I now had a choice. I could turn around and walk off like nothing ever happened, even though 400 people just watched it. Uh, and that's exactly the kind of thing that puts law enforcement in such a bad public light, to ignore, cover up, bury, whatever, rather than take responsibility for it. And William, I am not an especially good person, but I do have a conscience. And law enforcement already had enough problems without me contributing to it. So I got back in my car after I got cleaned up. I drove to the county and I arrested myself. I booked myself on third-degree battery, and then I OR'd myself, released myself on my own recognizance, and went home. My court case came up. I pled no contest to the charge I charged myself with, and the city council of that community paid my fine. They were waiting on me in court that day, and it was a misdemeanor, a Class A misdemeanor offense, and they paid my fine for it. But those two incidences together over that 10-year period, or three now, but that's what led the transition for me to move from civilian law enforcement into the federal realm.
Yeah.
I got a job offer out of it, paying a whole lot of money. I mean, way more money than I was worth. But it's cool. I was good with it. So I
Well,
jumped ship and went fit.
I can imagine, because I mean, after living through such an incident, I mean, several incidents like that, and it's how could you keep doing the same job then, especially with your family? Then if you know it's okay, this is where it's going, it's time to take a turn and do something else, right?
Well, the transition to federal wasn't overnight. I stayed
Yeah.
in that job 2 more years,
Oh, okay.
but I moved my wife and my daughter away from that particular area, um, and I went into a more of a administrative role.
Yeah.
Um, still had, still had baggage from former. And the odd thing is, I know I'm sitting here telling all of this shit. You've got some people out there shaking their head right now, going, "He's full of shit." All I can tell you is this public record. I mean, everything that we're talking about is public record. Um, so it wasn't like you can hide from anything. You can't ignore it. You can't bury your head in the sand. And frankly, the only reason we're talking about it now is I'm pretty sure this is exactly the reason Mark McYoung recommended to you that you talk to me on your podcast. I'm
Yeah,
almost
yeah.
positive this is exactly why Mark brought my name up.
So for the listeners, that's what
So
I
there was no avoiding.
well, I asked Mark when after I interviewed him a while ago, and I'll put a link to. I'm going to write that down. I'll put a link to the episode with Mark that I did a while ago. And I asked him afterwards, like, is there somebody you think I should talk to for the podcast who I haven't talked to before? And you're the first name that came up. And I'm like, okay, I knew of you a little bit, but not all that much. And then we got talking a little bit. You gave me some more information, and I was like, okay, I want to talk to Liam. um, it, I'm going to use that as a segue into the next question. You mentioned the federal work, and you mentioned before a little bit something specific that I'd like to ask you about, and that links both topics together. You said that undercover work has changed a lot. There's a lot of technology nowadays that allows makes it so that you don't necessarily have to send somebody undercover. You you went to do counterterrorism. Now, if you remember back in when 9/11 happened, there was a lot of discussion afterwards that there was too much of a reliance on basically technology and assessments and so on, and that there was a lack of pretty much human intelligence, people infiltrating those terrorist groups and going undercover and so on. Would you agree with that, or is that totally overblown?
Now, this goes back to the problem that we discussed briefly a few minutes ago. The federal government is so huge. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing most of the time, and the left hand likes it that way. They figure it gives them an edge when it comes time to go scratching for the almighty budgetary allocation. And because departments have gotten so big and convoluted, it's exactly why the memo got dropped going from the field agent to district within the FBI about the foreign presence taking the flight lessons in Florida, which led to training, which led to 9/11. It wasn't that it was never detected or set off an alarm. It's just that the scope of the navigation, that information has to travel, was so convoluted that it never got where it needed to be, so it was never followed up on. Technology is a grand thing, and it can do some things that humanity can't do, but as far as operational goes. But technology is only as good as the human that's using it, and that's where we had some disconnects. One of the things that came out of 9/11 was the uh, formation of the fusion centers in the United States. They are collection points for exactly that kind of information that got lost just prior to the incident of 9/11. You have representatives from several entities, including Coast Guard, Air Force, State Police, FBI presence, all in one building, all under one roof. As information is filtered in through tips from the public, law enforcement observations, chemical manufacturers who get requests for certain chemicals that are known to be used in explosives. All of this stuff now goes into one of several, I won't say how many, fusion centers. And that information is collected and disseminated to all of the agencies involved in that center simultaneously. So anything that one group knows, the next group knows. It's no more of what the right hand knows that the left hand doesn't, at least in regard to mitigation efforts. Uh, I am absolutely thrilled that we took that step as a nation those several years ago. And you never hear about the fusion centers. You heard a little bit about them when they were formed, but you don't hear about them. But they're in operation every single day of the year. They don't take holidays. Somebody is manning those posts all the time. They continue to update their own training. They examine MOs of known terrorist organizations, and they conduct tabletop exercises, etc., in order to see how the information flows upon inception all the way to the end game where it needs to go in order to stop the terrorist event. So a lot of times when you read or you hear about an event that got cut off at the knees before it actually went off, it's because of that type of information that went through the channels, through these fusion centers, went to the appropriate agency that could take the action to stop it before it became live.
Okay. No, no, it makes
Sense?
sense. Yeah. And if you look at, I mean, everything you did at counterterrorism, I mean, if you look at the big picture from when you started to eventually, let's say today, how would you characterize the differences? What's changed overall?
Funding and mobility of the bad guys has changed. Uh, Look, by nature, law enforcement will always be reactive. You can establish a presence, you can put up a billboard and say, we're here, but that's all you're doing. And the hell of it is, the bad guys already know you're there. They already know you're there. So you're not using law enforcement, and I don't care if it's the FBI, I don't care if it's an intelligence agency like the CIA. Hell, we all know they're there. That doesn't deter shit. What it does is it retrains the bad guy into how to get around it. We are constantly training the bad guys in how to defeat us. Then once they defeat us, they train us into how to counter that particular attack. So it's a constant 360 evolution of tactics. Um, Nothing has really changed in the landscape of tools that are used, uh, with one exception. The bio threat has been magnified 1,000-fold. It was always there, but it was under the public conscious radar. COVID, can't call that a terrorist attack. Well, some do. I won't get into that. That's a different ball of wax. But there are biological agents on this planet that, well, for instance, Marburg virus, hell, it killed the person it's named after. It killed everybody who ever touched it. It killed damn near everybody who worked on the evolution of that Marburg virus. There were 2 known samples, other than the plant where it was, use the word plant. It was more like a dungeon in one of the Soviet satellite nations. But the CDC and the Moscow counterpart to the CDC have live agent samples of Marburg. What we don't know is what happened to the shit that was in the facility that manufactured it. Because when the Soviet Union collapsed, all the government stipends ended, all of the little chalets ended, all the courtesans ended, and those people went somewhere. They went to the highest bidder, and all of the agents that they worked with, the chemical and biological agents, went with them. And we don't know where they went. And I promise you, for the last 20 years, we have desperately been looking for it, but we don't know where the fuck that shit went. We know it's out there somewhere. And there is not a more deadly bug on the face of the planet than Marburg. We don't know where it's at. So if we think COVID was a problem, if I take that same bug and I contaminate 5 people to put them on an international flight from, say, just for instance, say from Hong Kong to Australia or anywhere to Atlanta airport in the US, and then everybody that was on that flight with them gets off of those planes and gets onto connecting flights going somewhere else. I will probably kill about a quarter of the Earth's population in about 60 days. And there's no vaccine for this shit. No, no. So we trained the terrorist element to see how effective one virus can be. We didn't do it deliberately. But if you don't think that the terrorist oriented organizations on this planet didn't observe and take notes on how COVID shut down governments all across the planet, they saw how well and how efficient it worked. Now, you've got a whole army of other biological agents that can basically do the same thing. Most of them don't have the shelf life that one or two of the viruses have, but they can all do enough damage in the short term that they become a highly efficient way of attacking anybody, anywhere. That's the easiest attack on the planet is by a virus. And I hate to sound like I probably sound like an alarmist. I just understand the threat and how easy it can be. And I understand the number of think tanks that are in existence trying to figure out a way to combat it. I don't run in that loop anymore, except by association with some former colleagues. But I do know that of all the heartburns we have on planet Earth, the threat of biological weapon is probably a step or two higher on the ladder than nuclear is at this time. Nobody wants to drop a hydrogen bomb and then have to rebuild the infrastructure after they conquer your country. I kill off your population with a virus that's going to die out without a living host in 7 days. I get to walk in and just take ownership, like a turnkey operation.
Yeah, that's unfortunately that's a reality that a lot of people kind of missed after the pandemic. Is that pandemics do happen, and there's a lot of discussions of the origins of this one here. I'm not going to go into that, but what you mentioned is, I think, a sad reality. And to put it into proper context, like you said, if people think this one was bad, somebody a while ago described the response to this pandemic is like it's the dress rehearsal for the play, and not all of the actors show up. The ones that do, they're all wearing the wrong clothes. They don't know their lines, and they think they're in a different play. The lighting's off, the director's not paying attention, and everybody's just doing something, and nothing's really ready. We kind of muddled through this. If we have a virus that is maybe, let's say, has even just like a 15% mortality rate, 20% mortality rate, it would be exponentially worse than anything we have right now. Let alone something like Marburg, which is very scary indeed. And that is one element, and I'll put another one on the table, which is a while ago I was listening to a scientist who had very much studied this, and I forget the timeline and the exact virus, but he says, I'm going to say 10, 15 years ago, maybe longer. Don't get upset, people, when I miss the date. There was a bunch of scientists who basically mapped out the genetic code of a virus. I forget which one. And back in the day, the internet was not what it was now. So they thought it was a good idea to share that information, put it on the internet. And I was like, okay, this is for scientists, da 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 da. And what are you going to do? You need a lab that is a multi-million-dollar lab because you know you won't be able to make this. You need the knowledge. You need to be, a virologist and so on. After a while, they discovered like maybe we don't wanna have all that stuff out there, so they took it off. But by then, it had been copied and so on. Now, technology
Sure.
being what it is, it no longer costs millions of dollars to make a lab like that. And with the advances of technology that will happen in the future, it is literally a matter of time before some kid in a chemistry lab in high school can take that information that was available on the internet, which is still circulating, and make a virus himself. How's that for a rosy
It, it,
future?
it wasn't that terribly long ago that you could buy live smallpox samples right here in the Western Hemisphere. I could drive 1,800 miles south of where I'm at right now, and I could have bought a live smallpox sample. Um,
Yep, it is what it is.
you know, yeah, and there's so many classes of the bios that I mean, you've got classes of encephalitis, you've got hemorrhagics. I mean, dear God, um, if we ever turned our focus, and right now the focus has been on detection capabilities, so you can have a quick response for isolation. And again, that's not a bad thing. It's just a very small part of what a real protection plan would be. Um, Obviously, better control of this stuff. But look, as you said, it's already out there. Nothing we're talking about cannot be researched on the internet in about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Nothing we've mentioned so far. Uh, there were kids in my age group who grew up on some of these facilities. And you mentioned boxing earlier, Friday nights watching the fights, right? Well,
Yeah.
50 years ago, 60 years ago, there was a television show called Gillette's Friday Night Fights. It was it was produced by the Gillette Shaving Company that made razor blades and shaving foam. And it was a prime time weeknight television devoted to boxing matches here in the States. Had a huge following. Well, it was nothing for me to come into the living room of our house and see 5 or 6 or 7 of the defense biological technicians who worked with my father sitting in the living room talking shop. They weren't supposed to, but I could probably incubate an egg with rabbit fever by the time I was 13 as well as anybody, just by having big ears and being around that group of people. Um, Now, the odd thing is my mother thought my dad worked in the base post office all that time, had no idea what he was doing because he would always run her out of the house when they had Friday night fights. And all these guys would come over and drink beer and watch the fights. So she had no fucking clue. And, he would look over at me and say, "Keep your mouth shut, boy." Yes, sir. But, ears are open. I'm not talking, but I'm listening. But that kind of seed gets planted in a kid. And I promise you, I was not unique in that respect. We had bases all over this country that grew cultures or produced chemicals used in warfare. Um, we were fast learners after World War II about biological weapons. Japan educated us really well on the use of biologicals, especially with anthrax. Uh, Once that happened, the light bulb came on and we went full bore, full blast into production. I don't know how much of that stockpile still exists. I know we went through a phase where we agreed through international treaty to destroy a large part of it. We even assisted Russia with building their incinerators that would get hot enough to destroy some of the agents that by treaty we all agreed to destroy. I also know that we didn't kill all of it. We didn't destroy all of it. Not a country on this planet destroyed all of it, and never will. That's the nature of governments. It's not going to happen. So again, we do know that the Soviet Union disintegrated. We do know that their production plant for Marburg was not in Russia. It was in one of the satellite countries. And when that country fell, all of that shit disappeared. We don't know where it went. So yeah, and you mentioned a 15% mortality rate, right? Okay, 15% died. The other 85% that caught it require medical treatment. Look at the strain that puts on your medical facilities. We still have drugs today in the U.S., critical drugs like insulin, who's being underproduced because we still have not recovered from COVID.
Yeah.
My own pharmacist told me that his drug rep told him, and I know this sounds like third party, but he couldn't get insulin for type 1 diabetes. It was on back order. The company, the major company that produced insulin, did not have all of their workers return to work after COVID. So they had to take employees from tablet plants or pill plants, move them to the insulin production plants, retrain them on how to produce insulin, which meant there was now a shortage of tablet medications. And they still haven't caught back up to the insulin production level that's required or needed in this country. We're going to be going through this for years and years. I don't know how Belgium is, but I assume that shortage of critical materials like medicines, I'm sure that became somewhat of a problem during that 18-month period.
Oh yeah.
Is it still a problem?
Yeah, that for sure happened. And here it wasn't as bad, but for instance, in some part of Germany, it was pretty bad at some point, because one of my students is German and we talked about it. And where there's literally, I mean, like public discussion, politicians and media figures and so on talking about, okay, just don't be egotistical. If you don't really need that medicine, bring it to the pharmacy, give it back for the people who actually do need it. So that kind of rhetoric was on display. So it definitely happened then. And there's still, I mean, the shortages that were created because of the pandemic and the basically global shutdown of so many industries, that's going to take a really long time to fully finish. I mean, one of my clients, he is a project developer, so he builds, really big buildings. And we talked about this like last week, and I said, "How's things on your end?" He said, "Look, most of the stuff is okay now. Like a lot of the materials that we use, concrete, steel, and so on. It's we don't have the shortages like we had, let's say, 2 years ago. However, demand is much lower, so that's why there's more availability. And China's economy isn't booming as much as a lot of people thought it would. So we have access to it because the demand is much lower with the recession that is happening right now, with the financial crisis that's developing slowly. There's just less being used. However, it says if all of a sudden the market would pick up and there would be a lot more demand, we'd be in the same situation. We just wouldn't have everything here. My girlfriend, she does interior decorating as a side job, and some of the furniture that she buys for her clients just can't get it. It's just there's specific stuff that is still in back order due to the pandemic, and this is years after it started, and they still can't get some things. There was the example of a company that made these reclining chairs with a motorized unit that automatically puts the back seat up in a position, this and that. Everything was ready except one small computer chip for the remote. And they couldn't get it, so they couldn't ship it out, so they couldn't sell it anymore. And there's a bunch of like smaller stuff like that. Car manufacturers are slowly picking up again, but they still have a lot of problems. And I'm talking big brands like Audi, BMW, Mercedes that are literally saying, like only a few months ago, it's like, look, we can deliver your car, but you cannot get that option. You want to have the special air suspension, you can't have that. And if you want to have it, well, we really don't know when that car will be ready. Could be months from now, could be next year. We don't know. So that kind of stuff is happening. We're not talking like a small brand. This is some of the biggest brands in the world, and just the supply chain is still fucked up too. And this is, like you said, it's going to take years to fully keep going and get to the other end of it. And we haven't even touched upon Ukraine, everything that's happening there, and then basically the tensions with China that are escalating, the decoupling of the economy that's happening there. There's a lot of stuff that is happening simultaneously while we're still reeling from that pandemic. Nothing but good things in life, Liam.
True. Well, if you look at other periods in modern history, it's always been something. It's always been something. And we look at today and we think, well, goddamn, how much more fucked up can it get? Well, I think back to 1969, which is ancient history for some people. But it didn't get much more fucked up than 1969, 1970, 1971, Tet Offensive, Vietnam.
Yeah.
You look back to points in the 70s with racial issues. You look at political scandals with the Nixon administration. The amount of confidence that the American public lost with politics in general. And that's where the love-hate relationship with politics really got rolling in this country. And it's just steadily gotten worse. And it's another day in paradise. It's just another fucking day.
Yeah, it's I mean,
nobody.
Go ahead.
Nobody's shooting at me now, so it's a good day. I mean,
I agree.
It's a good period of my life.
I recently.
Wife,
go ahead, Liam. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I'm looking. I'm gonna remove the headphones for just a moment. I got to ask my wife a question, and it's gonna take it about 10 seconds.
That's okay.
A few moments later.
Okay, I had to get a verification there.
That's okay.
My wife says that her great-grandparents came out of Bavaria, went through Brussels, and then arrived here. Our conversation prior to going on the air earlier about her family being from that part of the world.
I think that might be like, what is the red line boats? That could be it, because there's a bunch of them that started from Belgium. I remember that. No, what I wanted to say is that I'm not a historian, but I am very much interested in history, and I've read a lot about it. And this is something that I recently posted on my social media. It's this a zoom in of an old painting, and I said something along the lines of, to the people who are saying now that today is horrible and it used to be much better in the past. No, it wasn't. And what you see is a battle scene. And there's a guy putting a spear into the butt of somebody else. I'm like, that was what it used to be like. And then obviously I'm making a joke, but not really, the overall living standards of the average citizen in a Western country has never been better. So we've got it really good now. The people who think that, like when the Berlin Wall fell, and then the whole thing with the end of history, and it's over, we've got stability now. The Soviet Empire fell, we're done with wars, and I was like, I understand why they said that, but that is complete and utter nonsense. You can track where I live right now, that area here, which now is called Belgium, but it wasn't always. you can go back for at least 1,000 years, and there was never a period as long that we had between the end of the Second World War and the starting of the invasion of Ukraine, which still hasn't come on in my neck of the woods. There's no fighting over here, but there was never this period of 60, 70 plus years of no war in this territory ever. Didn't happen. So the constant of history is war and conflict. And people think that, well, that is going to go away, are incredibly naive or don't understand history. Now, should we strive to try to get there? Of course. But you know, si vis pacem para bellum. I mean, if you want to live in peace, prepare for war. There's a reason why that is good advice, because you don't have to want to go to war and handle conflict, but at the very least, you should understand that this is the history of mankind for millennia. Mankind fundamentally hasn't changed in the last 100 years, let alone 1,000 years.
In modern history, there was a point where it was a pretty common saying that the United States engaged in an armed conflict on the average every 26 years. And if you go back to the Civil War and bring it forward, that's pretty damn accurate. Between every 25 and 30 years, we were in a armed, it's almost like a calendar. You set your watch by it. That 30-year mark is about as dead on as you can get. We were in an armed conflict somewhere. And hell, there's parts of this planet that have never been without an armed conflict.
Yeah.
Ever. So.
I always heard that war was good for our economy.
I'm not a doctor, and I don't, or a psychologist, and I don't pretend to be. I'm married to one. So when she hears me talking about ideology, she's got to throw something in there, and she's always dead on the money when she does. But
yeah,
you know, we talk about religion being the catalyst for some of the largest wars in history. And given certain scenarios, that's probably true. But it's almost always been about economic factor, about economic power. Money drive has driven more wars than probably any other factor, with maybe religion being a close second. But it's always been about economy. And you would think that the people that are a whole lot smarter than I am, which is most of humanity, would understand that the more prosperous any given segment of society is, the fewer problems you're going to have out of them. And it also makes me wonder what is really gained by suppressing any segment of your society, economically or socially.
It always ends up in tears. It makes it worse.
It does. Yeah, you're right. So I wish I understood all I know about human nature. I know some things to be true, ma'am. I just don't understand why they're true. I don't understand why they exist.
Yeah, the way I like to see it is that if first principles is a good idea. You start somewhere. Don't start with opinions and emotion, this and that, but start from first principles. And I think a good first principle to look at humanity is that a human being is by definition conflicted. We're not entirely logical, rational. We're not entirely emotional. We're conflicted. We don't know our own motivations all too often. We say X, but we mean Y. We think X, but actually we're feeling Y, and that influences how we actually think. But we tell ourselves this story about what we think we are and what we should be doing, blah, blah, blah. But deep down, in our subconscious mind, there's something else going on. Or we're lying to ourselves and we're like, I really know this isn't true, but I really want it to be, and I'm going to pretend it is, and blah, blah, blah. So we're conflicted. So what do you do? What do you have when you have several billion conflicted people in varying stages of their life running around on a limited planet with limited resources and so on? You get chaos and conflict. you get a lot of beautiful stuff as well. You get art, you get culture, you get, beautiful relationships, you get lots of stuff that is absolutely worth living for. But you don't get that without all the mess that comes with it, with the chaos and so on. So I think if we can start by accepting that, it's just we striving for excellence, striving for improvement and so on, whether it's as an individual or a group or a society, is obviously worth doing. But at the same time, doing it with a sense of realism that human nature fundamentally doesn't really change all that quickly. And by quickly, I mean over a period of thousands of years. The biology is what it is, whether we like it or not. And does it change? Yes, but very, very slowly. The chances that we as a society in 2023 can radically change all the parameters that influence human behavior just because we feel like we should, those chances are really, really low. And I'm afraid that there's a lot of people in influential positions who cannot live, who do not accept, human being as conflicted, as being conflicted as a first principle, which creates a lot of policies that basically don't work or backfire eventually. That's my thought.
You just described the American judicial system, that we want everything's black and white. Everything is, and way before that shitty book was ever written, the term 50 Shades of Gray applied to human nature, to apply to every aspect of human nature, because very few things in this world are black and white.
Yeah.
There's degrees, there's shades, and we want everything to be in a nice little neat, compartmentalized package that we can take out and put back in, and that's not the way the human psyche works.
Yeah.
There's things about first responder community and how it relates to the general public, and the stress and emotional drainage that hits those people. And yet we want to keep them on the job. We want them to be professional. We want them to be proficient. But the minute they show a crack in the armor, we got to get rid of them. What's wrong with that? Where's
It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It's expecting people who are put in a toxic environment and an extremely taxing psychological and emotional environment, expecting them to be superhuman. It's not realistic.
And we wonder why they crack.
Yeah.
Well, and the same thing with, we elect politicians based on sound bites delivered over the course of about 14 months. A quick 30-second ad here, a quick speech here. You might have a debate. There's more argument than debate between the 7 major candidates. Unless you take the time and really follow the person's career, you're not going to know shit about them. No. You'll know just enough to form an opinion, but it won't be an informed opinion. But people, we're too goddamn busy to take the time. And then we want to spend all of our time bitching about the result that we wouldn't take the time to address on the front end. That's another human nature issue. And I don't know how the fuck you fix that. If I did, I'd probably change the DNA of humanity, period. But, the older I get, there's 2 things I know. First, just personal opinion. There is a God, and I'm not him. I can't fix everybody's problem. I can barely control my own. That doesn't mean I can't empathize with somebody having a problem. And if I can help, maybe I will. Most of the time I do. But trying to fix anybody else is beyond the fucking realm of human capability. And we always want to fix the other guy. Have you noticed everything that we do in a political arena isn't about doing the right thing? It's about fixing a problem somebody else created. At least that's American politics.
Oh, no, it's over here as well.
It's not that I have a plan. I've got to fix the other guy's fuck up. every election, it starts out, I have a plan, I have a platform, I have a vision. And when you get right down to it, so-and-so fucked up, so I'm going to put a Band-Aid on it. My opponent or my predecessor, the person in the office that I want is a fuck up, and I'm going to put a Band-Aid on it. And anybody that tells you or goes beyond that is either delusional or lying, because you can't fix people. You can't. You're well thought out, you're educated, you're articulate, you put information out there, but you can't make a damn soul listen to it. You can't make them take it to heart.
Yeah.
You can't force feed it to them. And the minute you try to force feed it to them, their lips get tighter. You're not going to drive anything down somebody's throat. Presentation, there's an old saying in government where presentation is everything. You want the extra dollar, present your cause. It's how you package it. It's how you present your need. The need itself is irrelevant. It's how you present the need.
Yeah.
You got to put a bow on it, or you're not getting a goddamn nickel. Well, how fucked up is that? I mean, really, seriously. We know we have a border issue in this country. And the border issue is not all inclusive. It's not every square foot of the American border that's in jeopardy, but we have known hot spots, and it's not a secret. You want to know, hell, go park your ass down there on a half-acre spread along that border. You'll see for yourself. You don't need my opinion. You also got parts of the border where you would think nothing would ever happen, and it's quiet. And Canada is our greatest, most peaceful, chilled out neighbor you could ever imagine. Well, what 30 years ago we intercepted a tractor trailer coming across the border out of directional Calgary into the U.S. that had 250,000 rounds of rifle ammunition on it, 2 firing mechanisms for 50 caliber machine guns stolen out of a U.S. Army armory. It wasn't going to Canada. It was coming back to the U.S. from Canada. And we pretty well know where it was going. But, things like border security, if you have a crosshair on your forehead, like most Americans believe that we do, we are really kind of under the impression the whole fucking world dislikes us. We just have that attitude. We have allowed ourselves to fall into the us against them mentality. We think a lot of the world is dependent upon the economic status and possibly the military might of the U.S., but we don't think anybody actually fucking likes us. And instead of examining maybe why, we get belligerent about it, and then we do shit to really make people not like us. So it's a vicious cycle. We know there's some European countries that are somewhat dependent upon American technology and military power. We get that. There aren't as many of them as we like to think. A lot of the European nations can stand on their own fucking 2 feet and don't quite need us as much as we like to think they do. But, that's almost society in general.
Oh,
My wife's bitching about something back there.
Well, we've been going for about 2 hours. So are you still good? Because otherwise, I'd like to go to the bonus section on Patreon, because I've got my patrons who have some questions for you.
I'd probably have about another half hour if that's good.
That would be perfect.
I think you can get it done, or we can actually pick up. Okay.
No, that would be perfect. It's a bunch of specific questions that one of my patrons has for you, and I maximum half an hour. I think it's going to be less. But I want to thank you, Liam, for taking the time to share your experience and everything that we've discussed. I always enjoy talking to professionals, people, and especially with people who have like you have a long career, and can give like personal experience, not just in general, but very specific to the job that you did and all the different jobs actually that you did in law enforcement. And looking at it in hindsight and looking at the lessons learned, so that hopefully the people who are younger than us can learn something from this and or get a different perspective than the one they already have. So that's why I wanted to say thank you. Is there a place? Go ahead.
Very well. I was just going to say I've had requests to do like interviews before. I've never done one before. I've never sit down and talk with anybody in a public venue like this. The closest I've come was in a courtroom giving testimony against people who shot my shit up. So it was new experience for me, Wim, and I appreciate you being patient.
Well, and I appreciate you taking the time to give me the scoop, basically.
You did mention you mentioned Hollywood and undercover work.
Yeah.
About an hour ago, we touched on that. Jim Harrison, or no, Jim Harrison.
The name rings a bell, but I can't place it right now.
A low-keyed but highly respected martial artist from the blood and guts days of martial arts in this country. He kind of picked up the nickname American Samurai. Jim passed away not too terribly long ago. Jim was also a New York City police officer who got shot all to hell. He was a UC detective who got set up by other officers. And have you ever heard of the movie Serpico?
Yes.
That's supposedly written about Jim Harrison. So if you really want a hellacious story about working undercover, do some research on Jim.
I'll look it up, writing it down. All right. Is there somewhere online that people can look up your martial arts class or anything else that you want to share?
We're like a lot of low budget operations. We got a lot of students, but we decided years ago that Facebook was the obvious choice for us because it's basically a self-contained website.
Yeah.
You have a public page and you can have a private page just for your members. And that's what we've done. So we pretty much stick with Facebook.
Okay.
So anybody can contact me through Facebook, and if they want to be a part of our private forum, I'll be glad to add them.
Okay. Well, I'll add the link to the show notes, and then people can look that up if you like. All right. Well, folks, Liam and I are going to continue talking for a little bit more on the bonus segment on Patreon. So if you want to support the podcast, that's where you can go and listen to Liam answer a bunch of interesting questions that I got from one of my patrons. But as always, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you guys next time.